Today we have the second chapter of the origin of language, exciting new ideas about the origin of language. So last time we were talking about the origin of language, we were talking about the origination of the symbol using system in language as kind of a not really an evolutionary phenomenon, and by analogy with the origin of the symbol using system at the molecular level, DNA, RNA, and protein. So there was no pre-existing evolutionary system before that, and when this system came into being, it allowed evolution to occur, and then of course a lot of evolution occurred after that. So that's our sort of like overall perspective of how we're thinking about this. But nevertheless, we will talk about evolution, and in particular, this idea of preadaptation, which was an idea that Darwin spent a lot of time talking about. And the idea of preadaptation is when, for whatever reason, something evolves for a particular function, and then suddenly the animal discovers, oh yeah, that could actually be useful for doing this other thing instead. And so then it becomes it suddenly like allows us a different function to take place, and so we will talk about that sort of pre-adaptations for language that evolved for some other purpose, but then got taken over to be used in the language system. So last time when I talked about origin of language number 1 was talking about the evolution of vocal learning, and the idea there was that basically a lot of the adaptations to control articulation and speech sounds, achieve more cortical control over those things, might have evolved for sexual selection reasons, not for the urge to mean, not for the ability of speech sounds to represent something. Instead, they evolved for this other reason that Darwin talked a lot about, which is that the opposite sex liked the way it sounded, and so they increased the mating success of organisms that were doing this particular feature. It didn't have any particular functional advantage. In fact, it was a slight disadvantage because it might attract predators. But that was the original idea for the evolution of vocal learning, pre-adaptation for language. And I just want to go back to that just briefly to talk a little bit about squirrel monkey vocalization, because this has been studied in squirrel monkeys. Now, squirrel monkeys aren't extremely skilled vocalizers, but the actual pathways that were involved have been studied, and what we're going to talk about is something that probably happened. There's no exact evidence for it, but let's first look at the way squirrel monkeys vocalize. And so they're not like songbirds. They don't have any vocal learning. They have sort of innate sets of calls that will develop even if they're deafened. And it's known that there's, so how do you shut up a squirrel monkey? So there's this anterior cingulate vocalization area that was discovered in squirrel monkeys. It's just in front of supplementary motor cortex on the midline. And it's known that so if you lesion that area, the squirrel monkeys will stop making any noise. Not because they can't make any noise, but it's like they don't have the urge to make a noise. And so what does this project to? It projects down to something called the central gray. And I haven't talked about this, so we have to sort of briefly illustrate where it is. So if you go in the midbrain, so there's the superior colliculus over the top of the midbrain, and then the midbrain comes down, and you've got, like the red nucleus, down at the bottom of the midbrain. Here's the ventricle. You got the substantia nigra, red nucleus. I'll just put those in there just for kicks. And so where's the central gray? Well, if you look sort of at the base of the colliculus, there's this whole region like this around the ventricle. And that thing is the central gray. And it turns out central gray is basically the pattern generators for innate vocalization. And so you can stimulate the central gray, especially the bottom half of it, and get all the vocalizations that we were talking about last time, like all the alarm calls that a monkey might make, snake in the grass versus like aerial predator. So if you look at the central gray, it projects down to something that controls the larynx. And it has the ridiculous name of the nucleus ambiguus. I don't know why they called it this. I should look up what the reason is. Ambiguous, to use. And the thing about it is, it's not ambiguous. If you look at the nucleus ambiguus in a human, it's really non-ambiguous. It's this big bundle of large cells in the brainstem that projects out to the muscles that control the larynx, which are one of the gill arches. Remember, the jaw is the first gill arch, and then the hyoid is the next gill arch, and then down there a couple is the larynx. So that thing then projects out to the larynx, derived from a gill arch. Larynx that makes sound. But that's not all it takes to make sound. So the central gray is also capable of controlling other things, like breathing, and it can also control opening the mouth because you want the sound to come out. So when you actually make a vocalization, you have to sort of tense up the diaphragm, maybe squeeze the lungs a little bit, tension up the vocal folds in the larynx, and then sort of make some sound come out. So there's multiple things, not just, I shouldn't attach them to the nucleus ambiguus, not just there, but the central gray has to control all these other structures in order to cause vocalization to occur. So that's the path. We know that in an animal that doesn't have vocal learning, that's the pathway. So what do we think happened? Again, what do we think happened? So we've seen a similar thing happen. There's actually evidence for it happening in the case of monkey finger movements. You can see that the motor cortex has gotten low-level control of the things that cause finger movements. We see the same thing in songbirds, where the forebrain, if you look at a duck is not a very good vocal learner. You have some forebrain areas that project down to some midbrain areas. They're different areas because vocalization in birds comes from the syrinx, which comes from something like the tongue rather than something like the gill arch muscles. But you see the same thing. There's a pattern generator for duck squawks down in the midbrain that coordinates all the movements to make a duck squawk. But if you look at a songbird, what happens is the forebrain bypasses that central gray-like pattern generators and hits the motor neurons of the hypoglossal nucleus, which is the tongue-like thing that makes noise in a bird, directly. And so we think something similar has happened, where like face motor cortex and other things that control, say, for instance, breath. So face motor cortex et al., because there's going to be multiple things that we have to do, that these things bypass and hit the nucleus ambiguus directly. Now, like I said, we have a tiny bit of evidence from chimpanzees when they used to do experiments on chimpanzees, but chimpanzees aren't very good vocal learners, and so we don't really know whether there's an additional pathway there, but it's likely that there is. So you essentially still have the same pathway here, but you got this one sort of pasted on top that has lower level access, and so it makes the face motor cortex at a lower level, so it can coordinate. It can use all this different information to coordinate vocalization. And there's another nucleus, we'll just write it down there, nucleus retroambigualis, if you want to look at any of these things, and that guy also projects to the nucleus ambiguus. And there's probably projections that hit that one as well from the cortex. in humans. But like I said, we don't know for sure. Okay, so that's just to finish up what we think probably occurred in humans as a result, as I mentioned previously, probably of sexual selection for speech-like sounds without meaning. So that was the idea, that we essentially caused the evolution of all this change in motor learning and auditory vocal learning for reasons that don't have anything to do with conveying particulate meaning, like alarm calls. Okay, so let's transition over to scenes, origin of language 2. Now we clearly need need meaning because that's what language is about. Like, you say something and it means something, and then somebody else can do something based on the meaning that you conveyed to them. And so part 2 is where did the meaning come from? So let's look for a preadaptation for meaning, something that looks like linguistic meaning assembly, but was pre-adapted for something else, not specifically language. And to start off with, I want to talk about this idea of a main distal sense. So if we look at a primate, which we are, what you see is that it's very clear that vision is the main distal sense. So if we look at primates, about 50% of the cortex is in a monkey, macaque monkey, is visual. And so all the other things, auditory, somatosensory, motor, limbic, all those other things have to fit into the other 50%. So that's a very clear piece of obvious brain evidence that primates have essentially focused a lot of the evolutionary adaptations in their visual system. So they have color vision, very high resolution vision, but that's not the only main distal sense. And we talked about bats, and so bats were an example of using the auditory system. So 50% visual, but bats use the auditory system, and they use it for the same thing that that primates use the visual system for. So they navigate with it. They can sort of assemble auditory scenes where they send out echoes and actually sort of figure out what's out there in the scene. They of course use it for eating bugs, finding mates. So flying back into the bat cave. So that becomes their primary distal sense, and the vision sort of recedes into the background. But there's of course dolphins also. Now dolphins actually have a pretty good visual system, but dolphins have a rockin' auditory system, and they use echolocation as well. It's not as well studied as echolocation in bats, but we know that they can distinguish very fine details. They can basically sort of image the body, image your internal organs. Using their auditory system. They can easily distinguish male from female humans just by sort of echolocating against them. And their echolocation system is so powerful they can actually stun a fish with it. They can actually sort of focus acoustic energy enough to knock out a fish. So in addition to using it for sort of echolocation, it comes out of their blowhole is where the actual sound, the echolocation sound, comes out of. But then we talked about electric fish, and electric fish use this electrosensory system, which was evolved from the lateral line, which is kind of a specialization of the same kind of hair cells that you have in the auditory system, and they can sort of image the world with that. And then I mentioned previously catfish and other animals that really emphasize taste. So they actually use if you look at the taste part of their brain, the taste part of the brain is massively expanded. They have maps of taste. Of their whole body is covered with taste buds all the way down to their tail. And in addition to those little barbells that stick out, those are completely stuffed with taste buds. And so they're tasting their whole environment, and they've actually got multiple maps of taste buds in their brain, and that's one of their main sort of distal senses to sort of like get around in the world. But there's other modalities. So like, what about snakes? So not all snakes, but one of the things that snakes have evolved is a somatosensory night vision system. So if you look at a snake, like a pit viper, so here's the sort of like snake, not a very good snake. So here's the snake mouth, and you got the snake eye here. But there's this little pit in the front. Looks like a nostril, but it's actually not it's not a nostril. It's actually, so this is here, label that. That's the pit. So like a pit viper. What is a pit viper? So what happened is, the dinosaurs went away, and all these mammals evolved, and all these little rodent-like mammals went completely crazy, and suddenly there's a bunch of warm targets out there. And so what pit vipers have done is they've taken temperature sensors. They've taken, just like hot and cold that we talked about, and they really hyped them up and put them into this pit and turned them into an imaging, basically a night vision system. So what they do is they actually can detect the body heat of mammals so that they can see them in the dark. And if you look at the pit has a topographic projection into the superior colliculus, which directs head movements and sort of acquisition movements and biting and orienting the animal toward the prey item. And so the superior colliculus, we talked about the auditory input to the superior colliculus, but there's a somatosensory input to the superior colliculus too, in addition to, of course, the main visual input. So. And then there's another one, which is kind of an amazing one, the platypus, which I always bring up. So they essentially evolved electroreceptors in the somatosensory system, as opposed to the electroreceptors that were in the auditory system in electric fish. And so if you look at a platypus, it's this funny animal. It's got little, sort of web-like, it's a mammal, sort of web-like feet, and it's got this little beady eye, and it's got this huge, like weird-looking bill that sticks off. And that bill is covered with somatosensory receptors, but also electric. So you got somato and electric. And when they go underwater, they eat fish, and when they go underwater, what they do is they close their eyes and their ears, just to screen out any useless information, and they hunt with the bill. And so they're, somato-electric. And if you look in their brain, it's really obvious what's going on. You look in their brain, there's like a giant representation of the bill, of the somatosensory and the electric sense bill. And there's a tiny little auditory cortex and a tiny little somatosensory cortex. And so they're basically a somatosensory animal. They use somatosensory system as their main distal sense. So vision isn't special, except for the fact that it just happens that we're primates, and we've got like a great visual system. And so that's why we're going to, essentially sort of concentrate on the visual system when we talk about language. So now let's kind of really back out to the most basic level. And some of these ideas were developed from sort of thinking about the origin of the symbol using system at the molecular level. And so let's go back to the molecular level and just say how does it basically work at the most basic level. And how it works is you've got these DNA and RNA bases, and they they have a couple features, sort of binary-like features. So if you look at like G and A, guanine and adenine, they're long, and they make either 2 or 3 bonds, and then you have thymine or uracil and cytosine, and those are short, and they also make 2 or 3 bonds. So you got a couple binary features, kind of like binary features of speech, like you have P versus B. P has kind of a longer voice onset time. It's otherwise similar to B. So you've got these binary type features. They're recognized in small groups. At the DNA level, it's always 3. In language, obviously, there's different numbers. And those stand for a particular amino acid. And then here's, the next on the chain, that codon will stand for another amino acid. And then what happens is the amino acids are stuck together, but the critical thing is that when you, so here's the code, and then here's the amino acid meanings. So we've got some code that stands for these amino acid meanings, but the critical thing is that the proteins that all genes code for are self-assembling. So self-assembly. So what does that mean? So the instructions for how to cause the protein to fold out are not in the DNA. So here's DNA and RNA code. So instead, they just self-assemble. And what does that mean? They just sort of fold up based on the actual shape of all the amino acids. And what happens is you attach a bunch of amino acids together like this, and then they sort of auto-fold into this structure. And after they've auto-folded into this structure, they can then catalyze something. And they can sort of cause a reaction to happen that otherwise wouldn't happen very rapidly without that. So that's kind of the point of it. So the argument we're going to make about language is that maybe language is kind of similar. We've got this code-like stuff coming into our ears. It calls up some kind of meaning, which we're going to think is basically sort of a visual kind of thing because we're visual animals. And then we tack together a whole bunch of these visual meanings, and then they auto-assemble themselves into some kind of device that's capable of going and affecting some other part of our brain. And so that's the overall picture that we're going to try to put forward. Now, there's a big difference between this cellular system and so here's cells. And the language system, which we have to sort of state at the very beginning to make any sense of this analogy. And if you look at how cells work, you've got DNA, and the DNA is turned, through RNA into proteins, and then the proteins, gather together and make, metabolism, which defines what it means to be living. It's kind of a collection of a whole bunch of different proteins interacting with each other, generating stuff, and all stuck together in a cell. But if we look at humans, the argument is that humans have the same thing. So we've got some speech sounds. Somebody says something to you, and you recognize groups of those speech sounds to stand for some kind of meaning, maybe visual meaning, and then that goes and generates some kind of comprehension, where you assemble those meanings and you understand, like somebody's telling you how to fix a radiator leak, and so you assemble all those words together, and then it allows you to go and make an action in your car and maybe look for the radiator leak. But then there's a big difference, is that we can actually do the other thing. We can take a meaning in our head and and basically turn it back into code and tell it to somebody else. So that makes a big difference. But the idea is that we may be still using, this serial assembly of these visual meanings for, what I would call, a mental metabolism to kind of run our operating system, our language-based operating system. So let's just sort of focus in now on, what kind of a thing could we use as a pre-adaptation that was already there? It was already there in animals that didn't have language, that is kind of like this process of serially assembling meanings. So that's the goal. And so what is what is our analogy here? And our analogy here is to visual scene comprehension. And so let's just talk a little bit about what that actually looks like. Now, when you first hear this, like, I've given this talk to linguists, and their feathers will all get ruffled, and they'll be, enraged how, visual scene recognition isn't anything vaguely like language. But part of that is because they're not thinking like a filmmaker would think. And so what goes on in sort of a typical, visual scene recognition. So let's let's draw. So here's a guy doing some visual scene recognition, and there's another guy here, and they're in some kind of a room here. Here's the room. Standing in the room, and there's a chair over here, and there's maybe a window. There's a window, and then there's a painting on the wall. There's a little sort of painting of a boat on the wall, and so how does this guy doing visual scene recognition actually work? Well, say first, this guy, looks at this person, and say they just look at the guy's nose. Maybe he's got a big nose. So you just look at the guy's nose, and then after that, maybe he looks at the chair, and then he looks at the window. And then he turns over and, say looks at the boat. So here's, first he looks at the person's nose, then he looks at the corner of the chair, then he looks at the window, then he looks at the boat. So what does the raw material of scene comprehension actually look like? It's strictly serial. You don't realize how serial it is. It's very serial like language, like I'm babbling away. Each collection of sounds stands for a meaning, and it goes in your head and makes all these exciting thoughts in your head. But what does it actually look like at the neural level? Well, first, let's imagine we had sort of a neural camera that could see what was going on in area V1. And what would you see? Well, first you would see, we looked at the guy's nose, and so there's a big nose, and there's a smaller mouth, and smaller eyes over here, because we expand whatever we look at. And then we looked at the corner of the chair. And what does that look like? Well, so here's the corner of the chair, a giant corner of the chair, and then here's like the rest of the chair is smaller because we're not looking directly at it. So you got like a big chair corner. And then we look at the window, look out the window because whatever the person's saying is kind of boring. And so, we expand, we're looking at the center of the window, so we kind of blow up the center of the window. And then we go over and look at the boat. Maybe it's got an interesting sail, so we see the big sail there, and then here's the rest of the boat down there. That's the sort of awful mess that comes into your visual system that you make sense of. what's going on, it's pretty fast. It's like, 2 to 4 saccades per second, like bump, 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 bump. You're just going dunk, 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 dunk. I'm just looking around the room, sort of seeing where stuff is and sort of putting it together. And so that's the actual raw material of what goes into your auditory system. It's strictly serial. And it's not nearly as different from language as, a linguist might initially think. Now, let's just talk briefly about a couple kind of word meanings, and the example, one word meaning that I often talk about is polysemy. So polysemy, what is it? Poly just means many, many. Semi is meaning. So many meanings. And I always say every year, it's a totally useless word. It's a philosophers of science or philosophy of linguistics word. Nobody needs polysemy. What kind of words do you actually need? It's like, what kind of polysemous words do you actually need? You need words like put. Every language has some word that's like put. And what on earth does put mean? So they put things back in their place. A stock put. Put that down. There's like a whole series of related meanings. If you look in the dictionary, look up put, there'll be 50 things in there that are all related to each other. Some kind of generic action to sort of move an object somewhere. But the meanings are all quite specific in these different contexts. Or like a word like over. I'm trying to put this idea over to you. Or the ball is over the table. I mean, it just refers to all these numerous different things. Or line. Think of the word line. You have line of kings, or line of argument, or line. Let's line things up, or a traffic line, or you could have line your pocket. That's actually originally from the original meaning of line, because line derives from linen. And so your pocket is made out of linen. Line your pocket. So again, there's like a zillion sort of related meanings. And these are words that every language has to have. Or hand that over. You broke your hand. Or a word like me. So these are polysemous words that kind of stand for all different kinds of related things. And when you're thinking about language, one question is: do we have a system that has a giant dictionary in it in our head that has 50 definitions of put, and when put comes in, same old put comes in, what we do is we tick down through there. That was definition 27. That sort of seems unlikely to me. And one very concrete way of seeing that is unlikely is looking at what happens at the molecular level. So if we take an amino acid, so alanine is an amino acid. It's an aliphatic, meaning sort of methane-like or ethane-like amino acid. It's a boring amino acid. You can find it on meteorites. Not very reactive. And if you told a biochemist, you've got to run 50,000 chemical reactions, which is kind of what happens in a cell. 50 or 100,000 different chemical reactions are happening in the cell. And you told the biochemist, you've got to run, we're going to give you alanine and tryptophan and serine and a couple other things, and you've got to run 50,000 reactions with this. The biochemist would say, it's totally hopeless. These things are useless. They're not very reactive. They don't have enough enough prongs on them to do the kind of things I want to do. And so how does it actually work at the molecular level? Well, what you do is you attach all these amino acids together into this large, office building structure, a big protein like that. And then what will happen is there'll be an exactly shaped little active site of this protein that will be just the right shape to operate on some of the other chemicals in the soup. And there might be an alanine in there. So like maybe this guy's an alanine. Same old alanine, same old boring alanine, but once it's put into this context, it has all these different functions. And so if you have to describe the functions of alanine in a protein, well, it depends on where it is. Maybe it's some other part of the protein that's not at the active site. Maybe it's right in the active site. It could be doing 100 different things. But they're all sort of related to each other because alanine has a particular shape, and it will cause a certain shape in this self-folding, structure of the protein. So this is like an enzyme. This is, the full enzyme. So maybe words are like that. So, and the other example I always give is, what if you were anesthetized, somebody woke you up for a half a second, said line to you, and then put you back to sleep. And then later on woke you up and say like, well, just tell me about your deep experience of line. That's kind of what the initial experience of line is like before it's been tacked together into a chain with a bunch of words and assembled into some kind of meaning, like lining your pocket or, talking about a line of kings. So that's it's more concrete when you look at something like alanine, where you can see it's the exact same damn alanine, but it's doing all these different functions depending on what the context it's put into. So there's another kind of thing that we can talk about from language, which is anaphora. So anaphora is another characteristic linguistic phenomenon, and this refers to basically when some part of a sentence refers to something earlier. So a very simple, version of it was, say, John went outside. John went outside. Then John did something else. Then John, did something, whatever. Okay, so that's an example. And what's anaphora? Anaphora means that when you hear this John, it means like it's the same John as the one who went outside. Now, then. You could also say like, then he did, and that's the same thing. If you say he instead, well, he is going to, refer back to John again. And that happens all the time in language. We can talk about, Marty's crazy protein language idea, And what does that refer to? That refers to a whole glop of stuff, a whole sort of like, it's a whole paragraphs of stuff. Sometimes it just refers to like one thing, but it can refer to a whole sentence or an action or like, a whole theoretical construct, And so this is, something that happens all the time in language. The exact same thing sort of happens in two other contexts. It happens in proteins, where you see proteins will fold back on themselves, after there'll be a whole bunch of proteins like this, and then proteins at a distance will fold back on themselves, and then actually directly touch each other like that, and bond to each other sometimes. There's some amino acids that tend to bond to the same kind of amino acid. So same thing happens there, but the same thing happens in the visual system when you're doing scene comprehension. And an example might be, after you looked at the boat, now you go back and look at this guy again. Now, why, and what does that look like at the level of our V1 neural camera? Well, so now say this time you looked at the guy's eye. Okay, so here's the guy's eye, and there's the nose. Now the nose is smaller, and the mouth is smaller. There's the other eye. So what the visual system has to do is it has to say, oh, this guy is the same as the one that I saw the first time, and it has to kind of interact with it. So it has to know, is he more angry now, or does he not care, or is he turning and walking out of the room? And animals have to do the same thing all the time. They're just looking around at all the different other monkeys in the pack, looking for predators, looking at a leaf, playing with a little grass, eating a little grass root, and then they look back at the dominant male and just see, like, is he angry? Is he not paying attention? Is he looking at me? And they have to sort of relate that information, but it just came in as a blop, as a serial chunk of information that came into the visual system. And so you have that kind of a phenomenon going on in scene comprehension all the time. You constantly have to relate glances that are temporally distant in this chain of input glances to each other, and sort of tie the information together over time. So that may not be that different from the kind of things that we constantly do in language. I just used an anaphora there, the kind of things. What does that mean? Well, it's some vague idea of some kind of operations that sort of happen in language that are like operations that happen when you're doing scene comprehension. Okay, so still, like, if I was giving the talk to linguists, they would say, well, there's no, like, what about syntax? There's no syntax in vision. It's not like, linguistic syntax, not like Chomsky phrase structure rules, prepositional phrases. So, so where does syntax come in? Partly, the idea that there's no syntax in vision, again, comes from the fact that you're not thinking like a filmmaker. So if you're trying to film a conversation, say you got two guys, top view. So you got two people talking to each other. How do you film that? So here's one person. There's their nose. That's not a very good person. Let's just draw them as a simple head with their nose there, and another person with their nose there. So how do you film two people talking to each other? What you do is you first, so here's person one and person two. So the first thing you do is you put the camera here. There's the camera, and you film this guy. And then what you do is you put the camera, here. You rotate the camera and put it here, and film that guy. So that's how you film a conversation. And what does that look like if you look at like our V1 neural camera? What it looks like is you've got one glance, and you're seeing this guy, and so you're seeing him from the side. So here's this guy. There's his mouth, and then the next glance is you see this guy, and what does that look like? Well, now you're seeing the right side of that person's face. So that person is going to look like this. Here's their mouth, their eye. So, and then you go back and view this guy again. So that's how you film a conversation. And how do filmmakers do this? Well, they set up a storyboard. And what's a storyboard? It's just a series of glances, basically. And it's a series of glances that make some syntactic sense. Now, what if you decided, oh, I think I'll just move my camera over here and film this guy. So what if I film this guy from over here? Well, now we're hitting the left side of his face. And so if you make the storyboard up, what it'll look like is, first you're seeing the left side of this guy's face, then you're seeing the right side of this guy's face. And then if you suddenly, went from person 1 to person 2 with this, film person 1 from here and then film person 2 from here, what would it look like? It would look like this person just suddenly blinked into the other person. It wouldn't look like a conversation, because you wouldn't get that rotation of the face that indicates that you're sort of looking back and forth. So filmmakers know how to do this to make a scene look like it makes sense, like people are talking to each other or somebody's interacting with somebody else. You don't suddenly flip to the other side of the scene and it looks like somebody has just turned into somebody else. You don't get the continuity of feeling like you're looking back and forth. So what are the syntactic rules of what you can do? Like what can you do in a with a camera? And the first thing you can do is you can basically saccade the camera. And so what is a saccade? It's a rotation of the camera. So it's a rotation of the eye camera. That's what a saccade is. And when you're making a film, that's one of the things that you do a lot. You rotate the camera to a different part of the scene, maybe an overlapping part of the scene. A saccade is just a very rapid rotation of a camera. It's just like a movie cut. It only takes like 20 milliseconds. So bam, you're just in a new part of the scene. But it's not any old part of the scene. It's this part of the scene that's accessible by rotating the camera. And what's the other thing you can do? You can walk around. You can track the camera. So you can walk around. So and so if you want to make something that looks like a believable scene, you basically, these are the kinds of things you can do. Now you can just make random sequences, but it won't give you a feeling of sort of building up a spatial picture of where the actors are in a scene and what they're doing. So there is some syntax to vision, and filmmakers know it, and they know how to do it in order to actually make something that looks like a sensible, understandable scene. So it's not as rigid as linguistic syntax, certainly, because you can sort of go into any scene, any old scene, and just look at whatever crap is in there. You can, make sense of it. But let's sort of try to loosen up our idea of what language comprehension is actually like. So a lot of language comprehension is not like, reading every single word or listening to every single word of somebody saying something. If you're in a typical social situation, people are talking and they're blabbing, they're overlapping each other, you're missing words. Or like, I always like, I like to say how I read. So, how do I read a scientific paper? So here's a scientific paper. So I open up a PDF. In the old days, I would have opened up my Xerox, but I open up the PDF, and I read the title, and then I go to the abstract, and I read, a little bit of the abstract, and I go like, oh, that's kind of boring. And so then I read down to the conclusion of the abstract, and I say, well, let me just see, what's the evidence? So I read a little bit of the introduction like this, and I go, no, that's terribly boring, and so let's jump ahead and read this. I cut off in the middle of a sentence. I don't always read the whole sentence. And then I look at the figure and maybe read the figure caption, and then I go like, wow, what was that? And then I go back and read, this paragraph over here. I'm just putting like junk into my language assembler device. But, it works. I sort of get something out of the paper. I understand what the gist of the paper is. And I didn't put in any sort of like completely standard series of sentences that go all the way to the end. And so you have quite a bit of flexibility in how you read. Another thing that suggests this analogy between linguistic comprehension and scene comprehension is many years of experiments done originally by Mary Potter and other people, in which they just inserted pictures into sentences. So you would rapidly present something. You can do this very rapidly. You can do it at reading speed, which is like 4 words a second, but you can do it at super reading speed, like 15 words a second, really fast. So you can put in words just rapidly, serially presenting John bought the house, and then you put in a little picture of a house like that. John bought the house, and then you can continue, rapidly, with a bunch of words after that. And it turns out if you do comprehension tests, people can understand sentences that have pictures inserted into them at full speed, at the same speed as that they would understand spoken language, or even faster than they would understand spoken language. And so that suggests that if meanings aren't like pictures, they're at least similar enough so that you can just jam a little picture in there, and the system says, "Fine, I'll take it. It works great, just as good as a word." So that's another sort of indirect evidence that maybe what we're doing is something like scene comprehension. So what is the bottom line? So the bottom line is that perhaps we should think of language as fundamentally something that's like fictive scene comprehension. So maybe we should think of it like fictive scene comprehension. So what it's doing is it's assembling a scene using the same machinery that you would normally use to assemble a real scene, but instead what you're doing is you're assembling some scene of like what happened yesterday, or assembling some scene of what you want to happen tomorrow. And so it's obviously a lot more, the problem of regular scene comprehension is that it depends on the scene. You only do it in the context of a real scene. But if you've got this ability to actually essentially evoke a scene that either doesn't exist or represents a previous scene, that's tremendous power, tremendous cognitive power that you have to be able to do this. But it might mainly rely on these pre-existing mechanisms of serial assembly of the contents of a scene. So that's the overall picture. Now, when people think about the origin of language, one of the things that they think about, it's something I called like the semantic urge. So when you usually think about this, you think about you've got some hominins out on the savannah, and they're getting rained on, and they have this urge. I really want to tell that other guy that we should get together and make a lean-to to get out of the rain. And so you've got this urge to say something. And so this idea of how language originated is that it didn't originate, and that drove all the sort of vocalization apparatus. This idea that we're trying to present here is that, no, it's not like that. What happened was sexual selection drove all the vocalization apparatus specialization. And then at the last second, we discovered a way to tack that souped up auditory symbol processing, or sort of pre-symbol, because it wasn't really a symbol, it didn't evolve for symbolic reasons, but basically tack up that system to our pre-existing scene comprehension apparatus. And there's some fMRI evidence that I and other people have collected, where if you have people do wordless scene comprehension, what do? You see a similar set of areas, mostly in the right hemisphere, more in the right hemisphere than the left, to what you would see when you do language comprehension in the left, more in the left than in the right. So it suggests it's actually using some of the same, it really is using some of the same hardware, and you're doing, your right hemisphere might concentrate more on the current scene at hand, and then your left hemisphere is going to concentrate more on these sort of fictive scene comprehension, so that you can sort of walk and talk at the same time. You can sort of walk and then actually talk about something that happened yesterday, or talk about something that's going to happen tomorrow. So that's our picture, and so semantic urge, versus late attachment. So late attachment, of sexually selected, auditory vocal learning to scene assembler. And the concept is that this is perhaps a more reasonable way of getting around the fact that there's an evolutionary dead end. There's basically an evolutionary dead end in versus evolutionary dead end of calls, because all animals, all mammals, all non-mammals have this call system. And so the idea here is that the way we got around it is sexual selection for souping up your auditory vocal learning, followed by, at the last second, attach it up to the scene assembler. Okay, I think I'm just to the very limit there, Stan, so I think we'll end the recording there.